The Son of Man must be lifted up, like the serpent Moses lifted up in the desert. It's an extraordinary thing for Jesus to compare himself with a snake. For in the ancient world, serpent-gods were amongst the worst. Apep, the Egyptian god of chaos, took the form of a serpent. Medusa, the Gorgon sister of Greek mythology who turned all those who looked on her to stone, had wriggling snakes for hair. The Minoans, Egyptians and Norsemen had their snake gods, and they were rarely good news. In some Asian religions, the Nāgas, half-human, half-serpent beings, were feared inhabitants of the netherworld. And in the Bible, snakes represent danger and deception, trickery and temptation, demons and death. The book of Genesis describes the serpent as the most crafty of all the animals. Satan assumes that form to tempt our first parents away from trusting in God and toward trusting only in themselves. It doesn't end well for them or for us. As this first or original sin estranged human beings from God, each other, creation, and themselves, and set the pattern for sin ever since. But God also announced that he would put an enmity between the seed of the serpent and the descendants of Eve. But the spiritual struggle would long continue. Moses was no snake lover. In a contest of miracles before Pharaoh, his staff turned into a viper, and Moses recoiled from it, though God had told him to take it by the tail. Subsequently, his assistant Aaron's staff also became a snake and ate up the asps of Pharaoh's sorcerers. They met snakes again after escaping from Egypt. When the people murmured against God and Moses, deploring their desert fare and pining for the flesh pots of Egypt, God allowed poisonous snakes to invade the camp and bite many. The people promptly repented, and God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Those who gazed upon it were protected or cured from snake bites. The Nehushtan seems to have been a premonition of the rod carried by Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. To this day, it is a symbol of the medical arts. But it's a strange incident, this one, given Israel's allergy to idols. And King Hezekiah eventually ordered that the brazen serpent be destroyed. The wisdom literature taught us to flee from sin as from a deadly snake. And Jesus and John called their enemies a brood of vipers. We Australians know about poisonous snakes. We boast more species of them than anywhere else on Earth. 9 out of the world's 10 most deadly can be found on our shores. And if that weren't enough to make your skin crawl, ours is the only country where venomous snakes outnumber non-venomous ones. Ophidiophobia may officially be an irrational fear of snakes, but down under it seems perfectly rational. So what are we to make of Christ's prophecy today that he would be lifted up like Moses' serpent? In the scriptures and the liturgy, we often compare Jesus with a lamb, meek, innocent, sacrificial. A lamb, fair enough, but a snake? Well, in today's gospel, Christ reminds Nicodemus of Israel's history, when God at Moses' hand turned snakes that were the source of the people's misery into a means of their healing. Israel knew from experience that salvation can come from the most unexpected quarters. In our first reading from Chronicles, the people's repeated infidelities led to their demise at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. All seemed hopeless. The Jerusalem temple was destroyed, the people routed, many carried off into captivity. Yet after a long sabbatical by the rivers of Babylon, they were saved. And by someone out of left field, the Persian monarch Cyrus, whom Isaiah called Messiah, the Lord's anointed. God's ways are not our ways, his thoughts not our thoughts, as the same prophet said. And so salvation can come when and where least expected. Christ's insistence that the Son of Man must be lifted up, like a snake on a pole, is of course a reference to his being lifted up on the cross. On the face of it, it's the strangest of redemptive acts. Crucifixion was a particularly gruesome form of execution, designed not only to end one's life, but to maximize the suffering and humiliation before death, and so terrify the onlookers. So brutal was crucifixion that the Romans reserved it for the worst of the worst and exempted their own citizens. Yet it was there, in the darkest of places, marked by suffering, desolation, and death, that we encounter the fullness of God's love. For God so loved the world, he gave his only Son. The devil is real, and so is the spiritual struggle. But what would outsmart the wiliest of creatures, overpower the most powerful, undo Satan's temptation and lure us back to trusting in God? Would be the seed of Mary, the new Eve, Jesus, the ancient enemy of the serpent. In the contest of miracle workers, amidst the brood of contemporary vipers, in the cry for healing from their bites, we need one as innocent as a lamb, but also as wise as a serpent. We need one whose Lenten misery can transform ours to laetare joy. From the most unexpected quarter, the Lord's anointed arises, but this time as a suffering servant king. From an outsider condemned to death, salvation comes. And to use Paul's language today, we are raised up with him. Raised up with him onto the cross on Good Friday. Raised up with him out of the limbo of sin and death. Raised up with him out of the tomb at Easter. Raised up with him at the ascension into heaven. Looking upon him on his cross is no idolatry of a brazen serpent god or a poisonous Aussie snake, but worship of the one true God, the one from whom all healing comes, infinitely rich in grace. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his wounds we are healed.